This excerpt comes from Panorama, A World History by Dunn and Mitchell, and particularly comes from their chapter on capital, technology, and the changing balance of global power, primarily dealing with the years between 1860 and 1914. The spread of steam-powered industry. Britain emerged in the late 19th century as the world's leader in steam engine technology. By mid-century, the marriage of steam and coal transformed the country into an economic powerhouse. On the European continent, industrial hubs continued to grow and multiply. By the 1880s, the United States became a major exporter of goods. By the 1890s, Russia and Japan joined the club of countries whose technological modernization produced strong economic growth. In fact, in nearly every society with an agricultural economy and a relatively dense population, groups of merchants, officials, and intellectuals advocated for industrialization, even if circumstances prevented them from having much success any time before World War I. Industrialization on smaller scales, gains and disappointments. Elsewhere in the world, entrepreneurs and political leaders launched new industrial experiments, at least on a modest scale. The worthy but limited success of these initiatives revealed the problems that could thwart eager capitalists in countries with relatively weak technological bases. Internal and external obstacles to industrialization. In some countries, those in power failed to see any specific benefit in encouraging mechanical industries as long as peasants or slaves provided cheap labor and the landowning elite made money exporting raw materials, commodities, and food. Also, potential capital for investment tended to pile up exponentially in leading industrial countries, but remained chronically scarce almost everywhere else. Another obstacle was unequal treaty signing. Militarily and economically strong states pressured weaker ones to open ports to trade, set low import duties, grant special privileges to foreign merchants, and in some places to give up territory, all without offering the disadvantaged partner much in return, other than potential wealth for merchants and officials. In this way, strong states erected what historians have labeled informal empires. That is, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and Japan used inequitable tariffs, large bank loans, and displays of naval power to compromise the independence of other states in order to serve their own strategic commercial interests. By imposing such controls, the industrial giants stood to dominate global commerce without having to take on the inevitably huge costs of invading and ruling countries whose economies they wished to manipulate. Although Britain conquered South Asia and France subjugated Algiers by stages, European governments generally preferred to exercise less expensive, informal influences on weaker countries, at least until the 1880s, as we'll see later in the chapter. Despite the relentless big power pressures, several societies with largely agricultural economies created small islands of industry. In some cases, these experiments provided models for later development. Experiments in the Ottoman Empire and British-ruled South Asia are two examples. Turkish Carpets. Even though Egypt's ambitious industrialization program withered, hopeful capitalists in the Ottoman Empire started up new textile enterprises after 1875. Economic and political conditions were not especially favorable. Between 80% and 90% of the empire's population of nearly 26 million lived by farming or craftwork. Surplus capital was meager, and unequal treaties with European states allowed mass imports of cheap fabrics and other goods that the empire's artisans had once produced themselves. The state also had to pay interest on growing debts to European banks, expenditures that forced higher taxes on people who might otherwise have put capital into new businesses. Nevertheless, small groups of entrepreneurs, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews, imported European textile machinery, mainly to produce patterned, multicolored carpets that Europeans called Oriental rugs. These carpets had a large market in Muslim lands and a growing one among prosperous middle-class families in Europe and the United States. Ottoman manufacturers combined traditional hand-weaving methods with small steam-powered factories to spin cotton, reel silk, and weave carpets. They introduced new synthetic dyes from Europe and supplied weavers with cartoons, that is, preset templates of rug designs that merchants would sell. Shop owners kept wages down by employing mostly rural women of little education. But even though this industry flourished, it remained dependent on European merchants for machinery and for carpet sales abroad. Moreover, it did not generate nearly enough surplus capital to trigger industrial production of numerous other goods. And finally, no energy revolution could have taken off in that period without huge supplies of coal, which the Ottoman Empire did not have. At the end of the 19th century, the Turkish economy remained overwhelmingly agrarian farming. South Asian industrialists. This is where we often think of India. Entrepreneurs in South Asia undertook some remarkable factory-building projects despite major obstacles. And unlike the Ottoman Empire or China, India was not a sovereign state in the later century, but a British imperial possession. In the eyes of British industrialists, the subcontinent's population of more than 250 million, compared to about 31 million in Britain, offered a huge captive market. India's hand-loom weaving industry, which had exported cotton fabrics far and wide for centuries, declined steadily as European merchants bought raw fiber instead, shipped it to its home factories, and then sold machine-made cloth back to South Asia at lower prices than locally made cloth. In short, South Asia experienced serious deindustrialization in the 19th century, trending from higher to much lower textile manufacturing, the exact opposite of what Britain was doing. Even so, Indian business people continued to finance internal trade, invest in commercial land, and explore industrial possibilities. In the late 1850s, groups of South Asian and European entrepreneurs collaborated to start up steam-powered mills to make products that did not compete with British textiles, notably bags, mats, rope, and other coarsely woven products, fashioned from jute, a tropical fiber. J.N. Tata, a Bombay-Mumbai merchant who first made money with a cotton mill, founded India's first modern iron and steel plants. Having traveled to Europe and the United States to study metallurgy, and after he died, his sons and other family members sold shares of stock, mainly to Indians, to build a steel complex near Calcutta. The enterprise succeeded, and at the start of the First World War, the Tata Company was supplying tons of rail stock to the Colonial Transport Authority. Today, Tata is a conglomerate of corporations and one of the world's largest steel producers. Capitalism's global reach. Few countries built large factory complexes in the 19th century. Rather, people took part in the Industrial Revolution in many different ways, producing food and fiber, working for capitalist firms, and consuming imported manufacturers. Millions of people worked in steel and textile mills, but many millions more harvested grain, picked cotton, cut timber, or tapped wild rubber. The worldwide communication grid. In the first half of the 19th century, some economic thinkers in Europe feared that industrialization could sputter out because markets from manufacturers would not grow nearly fast enough to keep up with factory output. Industrial overproduction had already contributed to short-term economic downturns. The problem did not, however, reach crisis proportions in the middle decades of the century, in large part because producers were able to cultivate new markets farther from home. Modern rail and steamship lines allowed cargoes to move on regular timetables. This gave merchants and manufacturers more confidence to plan operations and estimate prices. Long-distance telegraph lines hummed with orders for raw materials, price quotes, and money transfers. The United States, Britain, Germany, France, and Russia led the world in railway construction. Canada, Australia, and Argentina also built impressive systems, benefiting from European capital and expertise. In the United States, rail engineers joined the Atlantic to the Pacific in 1869. Canada did it 16 years later. Private companies developed India's rail network partly to strengthen British military control over the subcontinent following the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857 and 1858. Rails were also laid in Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, Japan, Algeria, South Africa, and almost all Latin American countries. By 1880, a person could travel by rail directly from Mexico City to New York. The opening of the Suez Canal to steamships in 1869 slashed trade costs by shrinking the travel time between Asia and European ports. In 1800, it took 2 years to exchange a set of business letters between London and Calcutta. By 1914, it took 4 weeks. The age of undersea cable communications opened in 1851 when technicians sent messages over a line strung across the English Channel. After engineers completed a cable line between Britain and Canada in 1858, New Yorkers held a public celebration. One banner proclaimed, "Married, on Thursday, August 5th, 1958, in the Church of Progress, at the altar of commerce, the old world to the new world. May they never be divorced." And I'm going to guess that's a typo because it says 1958 rather than 1858. This marriage, however, had a rough start because the line quickly went dead. Nevertheless, workers tried again, pumping in more powerful electric current and inventing materials that protected underwater lines from corrosion and breakage. The new transatlantic line, laid in 1866, kept working. 4 years later, British technician connected London to the west coast of India, making it possible for an English mill operator to telegraph a cotton order to India in minutes. Feeding industrial societies. As millions of people poured into cities in the later 19th century to work in manufacturing, service, and export-import industries, other people had to supply them with nutrients. including foodstuffs, that often supplied caloric energy or a bit of pleasure. Farmers who lived close to burgeoning cities could not come close to meeting the demand, so food had to be shipped in from afar. Fortunately for hungry workers, the new steam-powered transport system increased the speed and lowered the cost of moving grain and other foods from one part of the world to the other. Food from Neo-Europes. Urban workers in the industrialized Europe wanted to eat wheat, beef, pork, and mutton, sheep. But increasingly, these staples had to come from other temperate regions of the world. In the 1880s, the United States became a major exporter of wheat and other crops. The grassy plains that stretched 1,200 miles from the Appalachians to the Rockies invited experiments in super-scale farming. Once the Army drove Native American peoples out of the way, and private companies built railroads to haul grain and livestock from prairie to city, commercial farmers moved in with the McCormick reaper and other mechanical devices. Flush with British capital, Canada followed the United States in mechanizing farming, mining, and transport. In the late century, investors began to exploit the grain, timber, and mineral riches of Canada's western territories from Manitoba to British Columbia. In Australia, stock ranchers pushed deeper into the arid outback, displacing Aboriginal hunter-foragers to make room for millions of sheep. Climates friendly to wheat, sheep, and cattle spurred economic growth in the southern cone of South America. Between 1871 and 1950, about 2.5 million Europeans settled permanently in Argentina, many of them making their living exporting wheat and beef from the fertile pampas. Tropical groceries and drug foods. Foods that flourished in tropical latitudes, including seed oil, nuts, fruits, and spices, also commanded growing urban markets. Most desirable of all were the drug foods, that is, pleasurable in some cases, addictive stimulants and narcotics, especially sugar, tea, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, and opium. Shipped in bulk from tropical plantations, these substances altered the dietary habits of men and women in every country where urban classes could afford them. A chronicle of the 19th century English cooking describes the popular new taste for sugar-loaded desserts. Quote, "Even the plainest dinner, served above the poverty line, was not complete without its pudding. Hot puddings, cold puddings, steamed puddings, baked puddings, pies, tarts, creams, milk puddings, and suet puddings." And there's the bell, folks. I gotta go. Tea and coffee mixed with sugar energized tired workers and helped restrain their thirst for rum or gin. Coffee houses and tea shops multiplied as gathering places for the middle class and working classes. Consumption of tobacco and opium to relax the body, sedate the mind, or relieve pain also rose dramatically. British merchants gladly helped addict millions of Chinese to opium, a powerful morphine alkaloid that financed purchases of tea, Britain's favorite but much milder drug. Capitalist farming. Merchants could meet soaring demand for tropical goods only because investors opened millions of acres of land to commercial farming. European and American entrepreneurs, often in collaboration with Asian, African, and Latin American rulers and landlords, cleared great swaths of tropical forests and grassland for cash crop production. To consolidate small properties into big plantations, entrepreneurs, often in collaboration with governments, bought up or confiscated peasant plots and required cultivators to pay taxes in money rather than goods to force them into wage jobs. For example, the government in Argentina and other South American countries allowed wealthy investors to buy up large tracts of prairie to produce food and wool for overseas markets. In South Asia, India, British colonial authorities encouraged wealthy individuals to consolidate land into big states, which paid scant wages to men and women who had previously owned their own spinning wheels and looms. In 1869, the British Cotton Commissioner explained in blunt terms the objectives of colonial commercial policy in one part of India. Now, it is not too much to hope that, with a branch railway to this tract, European piece goods might be imported so as to undersell the native cloth. The effect would be that not only would a larger supply of the raw material be obtained, for what is now worked up into yarn would be exported, but the larger population now employed in spinning and weaving would be made available for agricultural labor. Commercial crop enterprises expanded in many regions in the later 19th century, including coffee in Brazil, sugar in Cuba, cocoa in the Gold Coast of Ghana, palm oil in Nigeria, rubber in Malaya, and rice in Southeast Asia. Large-scale cotton growing spread from the United States to India, Egypt, and Brazil, and eastern Russia. Landowners recruited local peasant workers at the lowest possible wages or brought in foreign contract labor, sometimes from great distances. European and American capitalists supervising unskilled work gangs built rail lines in countries that produced tropical exports, though mainly to siphon commodities to seaports and waiting ships, not to help the countries integrate economically. Profits from these lines went to investors and local elites. This happened, for example, in Mexico, where the authoritarian President Porfirio Diaz, who ruled most of the time from 1876 to 1910, extended the country's rail network to 15,000 miles by 1911. Diaz talked of unifying the Mexican nation, but in league with foreign bankers and engineers, he aimed first to streamline the export of copper, lead, zinc, and a range of tropical crops to the benefit of investors, wealthy Mexican families, and the state. Farmers in debt. The movement of once self-sufficient farmers into agricultural wage work often led to impoverishment. And this happened notably in the world's cotton fields. The American Civil War drastically disrupted the southern states' export of slave-grown cotton. This development drove raw cotton prices rapidly upward. In India, Egypt, Brazil, and a few other regions where landowning or rent-paying peasants grew cotton for the market, entrepreneurs with capital saw this price trend as an excellent business opportunity. They pressed independent farmers to grow less food for themselves and more cotton for the market. Indeed, millions of peasants took the plunge and initially enjoyed good returns. Between 1860 and 1866, cotton exports doubled in India and tripled in Brazil. Families that grew less food, however, typically had to borrow from landlords or local moneylenders to pay taxes, to buy seed and tools, and to make ends meet while their cotton crops ripened. After the Civil War ended, American cotton production revived quickly and world prices plummeted. Small cotton farmers everywhere found themselves spiraling into debt. If they could not meet their obligations year after year, they became debt peons, men and women destined to perform agricultural or other wage work and make regular debt payments for the rest of their lives. In the later 19th century, millions of farmers in India, Egypt, Latin America, and the southern United States harvested cotton or other crops for the global market, whether they wanted to or not. Rich regions, poor regions. From the dawn of the complex societies 6,000 years ago to the Industrial Revolution, all agrarian societies had richer and poorer social classes. Typically, aristocratic classes enjoyed generous access to surplus riches, while farmers and workers had much humbler standards of living, whether they lived in China, West Africa, or Spain. By the late 19th century, however, disparities in living standards correlated with social rank not only within a society, but also between societies in different parts of the world. Most notably, average individual incomes and life expectancy improved in the major industrializing regions faster than in countries producing only primary commodities, raw materials. Near the end of the century, for example, an industrial worker in Berlin might expect to live around 42 years, but a laborer in Bombay only 28 years. Farm families in India, China, and Peru were generally getting poorer, whereas farm families in France, Germany, and Canada were bettering their lot, at least a little. This widening gap between have and have-not societies has confounded humankind ever since. Several factors contributed to it, some of them local, but others global in scope. World population growth. First, the world population grew from about 1.27 billion to nearly 1.8 billion between 1870 and 1914. On a global scale, cropland expanded greatly as well. However, in many predominantly rural regions, notably in Latin America, poverty intensified because population growth accelerated, but neither new land nor many labor-saving technology improvements became available. Consequently, living standards declined. Even so, chronic impoverishment cannot be attributed simply to, quote, overpopulation. In China, for example, living standards generally fell, even though the country's overall population grew only moderately between 1870 and 1913. An uneven playing field. The buildup of investment capital, technical skill, and military power in the industrializing countries gave them a powerful advantage over non-industrialized societies. They could drive out local industries by importing their own cheap goods, like in India, depress local wages by introducing foreign migrant workers, or apply political pressure to force down tariffs, all of which hurt the weaker country's economy. These arrangements rigged the system, as it were, making it profoundly difficult for non-industrialized states to diversify their economies, especially when their own affluent class colluded with Western capitalists to accumulate wealth. In Mexico, for example, the real wages of ordinary men and women fell throughout the 34 years that Diaz ruled, whereas foreign investors and 200 elite families amassed about 50% of the land. Ups and downs in the global economy. Under the biological old regime, that is, the world before the modern energy revolution, economic well-being in all agrarian lands depended on the equality of annual harvests, which depended on natural and social conditions, weather, natural disasters, social stability, foreign invasion, and so on. However, as countries industrialized and global trade surged, world economic conditions became more vulnerable to what economists began to call business cycles. These fluctuations in production, consumption, and trade were related to changing balances between industrial output of goods and consumers' demand for them. They might last anywhere from a few months to several years. Also, the greater global economic integration ensured that a downturn in one part of the world might affect growth in other regions as well. Economic integration, global economic integration, big. In 1873, for example, a severe depression spread around the world, and commodity prices plunged downward. Company financial shares plummeted, railroads went bankrupt, and iron mills shut down. And to reduce costs, both factory owners and commodity producers cut wages. Land-owning peasants lost income when prices fell. Indeed, prices for cotton, sugar, tea, and other tropical merchandise remained depressed for nearly a quarter century. The world economy shifted into a new expansive phase only in 1896, but by then, more of the world's population than ever had become locked into long-term poverty. Deforestation and drought. A final factor in the growing gap between the rich and poor regions was environmental change. In the 19th century, humans dramatically accelerated their efforts to burn and clear forests to supply lumber and to grow more food and fiber. In Brazil, coffee fields consumed immense tracts of tropical forest. In equatorial Indonesia, Dutch and other European planters and loggers eradicated millions of acres of natural growth. Deforestation profited some, but it also led quickly to soil erosion and exhaustion, which could mean diminishing returns on intense labor on both large plantations and small family farms. Governments and landowners could have retarded deforestation if they had tried harder, and a few regimes, notably Japan, implemented serious conservation programs. Global weather events were another matter. At three different periods in the latter 19th century, 1876, 77, 1889 to 91, and 1896 to 1902, severe droughts followed by ghastly famines afflicted large areas of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and to some extent North America and Europe. These natural crises were associated with successive El Niño southern oscillations, the periodic atmospheric phenomenon related to a rise in surface temperatures in the South Pacific Ocean. A journalist described the consequence of the 1878 drought in Mogador, or Essaouira, a city in the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The pauper population, the poor population of Mogador, always disproportionately large, is being rapidly increased by the numerous famished Jewish and Muslim families from the adjacent districts. It is a fearful sight to see some of them, mere living skeletons. They are selling their clothes and furniture to obtain food. El Niño episodes were nothing new in history, but these droughts happen to coincide with decades when capitalists extract larger and larger amounts of foodstuffs from rural lands. In South Asia, for example, the British colonial regime took the view that to help for the poor was admirable, but that nothing should interfere with commodity exports. Indeed, railcars and steamships continued to load wheat destined for England, as starving Indians stood watching. In Asia alone, the death toll from the three El Niño events reached 20 to 25 million. The famines also debilitated sovereign states, especially in tropical Africa and Southeast Asia, making them more vulnerable to European invasions, as we shall see came later in the century.